Welcome everybody to the latest Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies workshop. It's a real pleasure to have you all here today, and it's going to be a really interesting, I think, combination of people from climate NGOs and practitioners and advocates for climate assemblies, where I think it's really interesting and important conversation. The workshop has its origins, and Alina may say more about this in her introduction, but this workshop has its origins in a recognition that many climate NGOs are skeptical or even sometimes hostile towards climate assemblies, and others have embraced climate assemblies as a new form of climate governance. And so one of the early projects that Alina led was looking at the attitudes of climate policy actors towards climate assemblies and trying to understand that range and reasons for those different perspectives. And actually, we've just finally published that as a briefing, and we'll put a link into the chat in a second. So we thought that based on that work on the attitudes of climate actors, we decided that we would start a series of conversations between climate NGOs and members of the Knowledge Network, which Alina has been curating, and that has led her to develop a playbook for NGOs in relation to climate assemblies. And it's a real pleasure that she's going to present her ideas today, which will then, this workshop will then feed into the final version of that playbook. I forgot to say, and I always forget to say, we're recording this, so please, if you're not happy to be recorded, please leave your camera off, but we'd rather see your face, obviously. So first of all, I'd really like to thank Alina for all the work she's done so far in this area, and I'm really excited today for her to lead this workshop and take us through some of her thinking in relation to how NGOs can engage with climate assemblies. So Alina, over to you, my friend.
Hello everyone, and lovely to see so many familiar faces, but also some new participants today. Let me just make sure, can you see my screen? The slides?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. So really the discussion today is to present to you, as Graham described, a draft playbook for NGOs and climate assemblies. And what I'd really love to do today is for you all to interrogate what I'm presenting from the perspectives of both the format, are we actually doing it in the right way, speaking to the NGOs on why and how they could engage with climate assemblies, but also in terms of specific content. And my presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with practitioners who I'm also looking forward to getting more feedback from. So basically the structure for the discussion, I will present to you the context for the playbook, and then I will go through what I've called an 8-step approach for NGO engagement on climate assemblies. And we could think whether 8 steps capture everything, or maybe you will give me feedback that I'm missing something. And then we will have a discussion with the panel and with all of you. So the playbook starts with the context. Why do we actually need public participation in climate policy? And with key definitions. What I've noted in the previous project that Graham mentioned, while interviewing colleagues from the NGO community, there is still quite a lot of confusion. What is the difference between the concept of public participation, which is direct engagement of everyday people and political decision-making, and stakeholder participation, which effectively is engagement of organized interests in policymaking, such as environmental, youth NGOs, business associations, and so on. And within that, I explain what is a climate assembly, and its distinct feature, which draws on a representation of the average makeup of society in terms of socioeconomic, gender, and political characteristics, and explain also how the citizens' assemblies are put together. I think most of you are familiar with that, so I won't spend too much time on that. But the playbook then goes to outline why public participation on climate change can actually help specifically NGO community, in terms of delivering more robust and ambitious climate policies to ensure that they reflect the interests and attitudes of citizens. They can help break political deadlocks and give confidence to political leaders, increase legitimacy and public acceptance of action, and also can help develop more politically aware and confident citizenry. The playbook also outlines the legal basis for public participation on climate action in the context section. And that legal basis starts with the Aarhus Convention that actually grants the right to the public to access information and also participate in decision-making concerning environment. And then it also mentions some specific opportunities which arise as part of the European climate and energy regulation through so-called governance regulation, where member states actually have to ensure that public is given early and effective opportunity to participate in preparation of national energy and climate plans, for example. And I also note, as we know, that citizens' assemblies increasingly have been the choice for politicians who actually would like to run public participation around climate. And this is why it's important for the NGO community to pay attention to them. The playbook then outlines very briefly what is Climate Assembly and how it works. Again, I think this community today has already pretty good knowledge of that, but basically talks about the lottery and the 2 stages in that, and the random selection of citizens to ensure that representation of the average makeup of the society, the deliberation aspect that actually allows citizens to learn and to come to a shared position for a mutually respectful and collaborative decision-making procedure. And finally, the recommendations, and makes it clear that citizens' assemblies actually don't make decisions, but provide recommendations, which is a source of much confusion, I think, sometimes in the NGO community. Now, the playbook also specifically discusses what are the roles that NGOs could play vis-a-vis Climate Assembly, with some specific examples. And as we know, they can be the proponent or advocate for the assembly. We had several countries where NGOs and, for example, Extinction Rebellion have been pushing for the assembly to take place. They could become even a convener or co-organizer, as in the case of Germany recently, where NGOs held the Climate Assembly. They can and should provide expertise during the assembly. They can be called to give testimonies. They could also be an independent observer and message amplifier, making sure that, and a watchdog, making sure that the process takes place in a credible manner, and also push for follow-up to the recommendations. And finally, a key role for NGOs is to be a campaigner and advocate based on the key recommendations of the assemblies. And we have some examples of where that has taken place. So this is the context and the reason why NGOs should actually engage with that. On the basis of that, I have developed sort of an eight-step process that I would like to test with you today for NGO engagement. So the first 3 steps are before the assembly actually takes place, which at this infographic, which is still work in progress, but you can get the idea, would include understanding the opportunity, defining strategic objectives, and advocating or supporting advocates for Climate Assembly to take place. Then, as the decision to hold an assembly has taken place, we have 4 further steps, which is contribution to the design, providing expert input, and actually communicating about the assembly. And then after the assembly has come out with recommendations, the steps would be pushing for following up to the recommendations and also building the recommendations into the NGO political campaigns. And throughout this whole 8 steps, this part on the bottom, which is very important one, which should start very much up front, not after the assembly has already taken place, which is strategic communication around that. So this is the overview of what's coming. And now let me walk you through specific steps that I have outlined. The first stage, which is the before the assembly, assessment, strategy, and advocacy. So the first step concerns NGOs understanding and identifying opportunity and internalizing that understanding institutionally, why assembly could actually be important one to engage with, and why assembly could actually be a good mechanism to help advance some of the objectives that climate NGOs are trying to pursue. And in that step, the key kind of crucial actions would be to learn about past climate assemblies, their remit and their impact, and Knoca materials would be quite useful in that. The playbook makes reference to them. And then secondly, consider the potential for the assembly specifically to advance public and political debate on climate action and to advance policy and lawmaking. And I'm giving there some quotes, which I think those of you who joined us for the discussion on the previous project, which looked at the attitudes of climate policy actors, would be familiar with, but they basically represent some of the impacts of climate assemblies in terms of, for example, the quote from the UK Parliament on how the assembly shown that the public is ahead in their thinking and prepared to go further than the politicians. I also address in summary in this briefing, in this playbook, the key misconceptions, and that's something that NGOs would have to deal with at this very first step of understanding the opportunity. That first of all, citizens would not be taking decisions, but making recommendations. Therefore, assembly does not threaten representative democracy, the role of parliament, or the role of NGOs themselves. That past practice shows that citizens actually are able to handle complex issues like climate change when they are provided appropriate input and an opportunity to learn, and can actually come with creative solutions. And finally, this misconception about ambition, which many NGOs are concerned about, that citizens may come up with recommendations that are less ambitious. So we deal with that upfront in the playbook. And then the playbook provides some additional useful considerations in the context of identifying this strategic stance for the NGO at the first step. First of all, I think it's this important point that contrary to misconceptions still spread among the civil society and politicians, citizens can actually be among the most powerful allies of NGO community and pushing for ambitious and effective climate response. And I also suggest that given that NGOs are public interest institutions, it's actually a duty for them to help ensure that citizens' input is appropriately considered in climate policy making. And again, recommendations from a representative group of citizens that make up for an average makeup of the population could be a hugely powerful argument for political advocacy. Yet, for this to work, the process needs to be considered as credible and legitimate. And the impacts of the assembly, as we know, cannot be ensured post factum. So they actually require NGO engagement upfront. And I explicitly talk about the mistake that many NGOs make to distance themselves, wait for the assembly recommendations to come out, and then to decide whether they would engage with it, which effectively represents a missed opportunity. And in that context, there are some ideas on what are the issues that are best suited for climate assemblies that NGOs, again, could assess in terms of considering an assembly as part of advocacy for an assembly as part of the strategy. So these are issues where there is still opportunity to make change to the policy, so the decision has not been finalized. There is a dilemma that offers trade-offs where public opinion would be useful and input from citizens would be useful to tackle it. And policymakers recognize the need for change and would be receptive to public input. That's a very important point where NGOs actually oftentimes have a much better sense on that than other actors in the policy community. Sometimes specifically on climate, they might have better sense than deliberative democracy specialists that would be pushing for the assembly. So that's where input from NGOs is very, very important to help understand this political interest, but also to help amplify and get potentially politicians more interested in getting such input. There needs to be sufficient time. And again, there need to be influential policy actors that are ready to champion the assembly and its recommendation. And again, NGOs would need to decide whether they would be willing to do that and also to mobilize other actors in the community. And without their participation, it's actually very difficult to do that. So that's the first step. And hopefully having gone through those considerations, it becomes clear whether and how pushing for climate assembly or supporting the assembly that is already being suggested aligns with the strategic objectives. And at the step 2, what I suggest is useful to do is to define specific objectives you would be working towards as an NGO that an assembly can contribute to achieving. And most climate NGOs would be very clear about their strategy. They would be either lobbying towards a particular piece of climate legislation or energy legislation or underlying policy programs. They may be therefore hoping that an assembly can help them drive those changes to legislation and policy that they're pushing for, and they should assess whether this would be indeed a useful synergy. Climate assemblies can also help shift political debates and positions on climate, and that's also effectively what NGOs are working towards. Media coverage, but also empowering and changing behavior of citizens. So would be actually very useful. What I'm suggesting in the playbook is to go through the list of potential objectives and decide to which ones of those the particular assembly would be helpful and work out the strategy based on that. The playbook then provides examples of the impacts of past assemblies, the impact on policy in Ireland and France, where assembly actually drove some of the concrete legislative changes, the impact on stakeholders, and the example of climate change assembly in the UK, and the recommendations being used by the Climate Change Committee to integrate deliberative methods into its work, and other examples as well. Now, having determined how the assembly could potentially contribute to the strategy that climate NGOs are pursuing overall, it is also very useful to consider specifically where assembly can add most value in terms of the focus or expected focus of its recommendations. And this question goes directly to the remit of the assembly, and effectively the recommendations that the playbook makes is that NGOs should think about that and engage in the discussions about the remit of climate assembly. And the remit could be focused on strategic targets, for example, achieving net zero by a certain date, could be more focused on longer term decisions and guidance on the scenarios that citizens prefer. And you would be, those of us who follow Knoca would be familiar. This comes from the briefing that we prepared earlier, which looked at remits of climate assemblies. And then it could also be focusing on proposals for concrete policy measures. And again, NGOs as proponents of ambitious climate policy and also keeping the finger on the pulse of the political debate have a much better insights on what is useful in the policy debate when sometimes some of the other players which are pushing for climate assembly. So it's very important for NGOs to be part of the debate on the remit of climate assembly. Here are some examples of potential issues, which I think I've already mentioned. So the playbook also gives examples from the past or ideas which came up during the consultations for this project. And finally, in defining specific strategic objectives, the playbook suggests that it's important to also consider potential risks and how the NGO can contribute to mitigating them. And those are related to relevant remit, not to have too broad mandate, to have concrete outcomes coming out of the process, issues around robustness and transparency. And again, NGOs acting as a watchdog in the process could help in that, and weak integration to the political system. And I think I've already mentioned those key questions. Can actually NGOs help create more political will to listen to the recommendations, or at least to consider them properly? And I've also created the table here, which basically suggests how NGOs could help mitigate different types of risks here with some concrete steps. So I'll give you an example. I won't go through all of that, so we don't have too much time. But for example, one of the risks and one of the weaknesses, as we know, of climate assemblies has been the lack of political follow-up. So climate NGOs can help with that by early on identifying and engaging with political champions, and ideally across the political spectrum, so that the assembly is not seen as a partisan process or pushed by the Greens only, but actually seen as a non-partisan one. Very important. So building those political champions, aligning those political champions to actually support the assembly or to be ready to consider and act on its outcomes is important, and NGOs can play a key role in that. Secondly, increasing attention to the assembly by communicating about it to the media, on social media, and also importantly, collaborating and mobilizing alliances with other NGOs on messaging around the recommendations, for example, and highlighting also innovation and most powerful ideas coming out of the assembly. So that's these are some of the ideas. So I'm looking forward to your feedback on those. Step 3 is actually, once that strategy, once the understanding on the benefits and risks of climate assemblies is clear for an NGO, once the specific strategic objectives are there, then we move to step 3, which is where NGO can move to advocating or actively supporting other advocates for holding climate assembly. And there are several key components to that. It would be connecting with deliberative democracy experts working on the assembly, coordinating with other policy actors to get a balanced political perception of the assembly, develop the case and make recommendations on the remit, engaging with commissioning authority, and considering joining the organization committee and communicating around that. So that's kind of prior to the preparation of the assembly. Now we move to what NGOs can actually do during the assembly itself or at the final stages of preparation. And here, first of all, they can contribute to the specific design, as I said, providing input on the desired objectives, most useful focus, and expected impact. And actually, from the past assemblies, we can see that a lot of times organizers are actually engaging with NGOs up front. Sometimes, well, the feedback on how useful, how receptive the commissioners are to the NGO input is mixed, but I think it's a very important stage, and I think the more NGOs are interested and ready to contribute, the better results we're going to see in terms of the design of climate assemblies. They can respond to calls for input on the agenda and design. For example, in Spain, the government has specifically requested inputs, including from NGOs prior to the assembly. There has been some critique which came from the NGO community, but perhaps Maria Jose can talk more about that in her remarks later. They can also push for more credible design. Importantly, the playbook makes the point that they should not expect and they should not ask for an upfront promise that all recommendations will be implemented, but rather ask for credible process of follow-up. Step 5, NGOs are and should provide expert input into the assembly itself. Many of them are called to serve in expert capacity, either on a joint to join expert group. For example, again in Spain, there were a few NGOs who served in that capacity. In Austria, there was a specific stakeholder group established of which NGOs were part, and there was a mechanism for them to interact with the assembly organizers and with the members of the Climate Assembly, and act as a watchdog already during the implementation to make sure a process is credible. And here, useful considerations that the playbook mentions is that while NGOs should engage as much as possible with the assembly, but they should also be aware of the risk of it being perceived as being driven by green and NGO interests. Therefore, it's important to ensure the input is balanced and there are also other stakeholders supporting the assembly. Inputs obviously should be in accessible form and based on evidence rather than driven by political considerations. That's a tip for NGOs that come as expert witnesses to the assemblies. And this point, I think, and I hope we can address it more when we go to the discussion, if and when the need to criticize the assembly arises, and that happens, and that's essentially part of the watchdog function that NGOs historically play, it's important to consider the best channel for this critique, but also the way that critique is structured so that there is a possibility kept for the NGO to still support the outcomes of the assembly. And that is a problem that we have seen in a number of countries where NGOs have been very critical of the process up front. And then they've actually admitted in interviews that it was difficult for them to come and capitalize on the outcomes of the assemblies when the assembly was finished. So I think that's an important point to note, and the importance to engage as early as possible. Step 6, which I think I mentioned that something goes throughout, but specifically during the process, it's important to raise awareness of general public, but also among politicians and the media, using assembly as an information point when NGOs give interviews to the media or issue press releases, and use other forms of media communication. Having Climate Assembly provides actually great information point for that. And we have seen some NGOs, for example, Marea Deliberativa in Spain, also running social media debates and campaigns around the assembly. And that could be also one tool that NGOs could effectively use to raise overall attention to the issue of climate change, not just being limited to discussing the assembly itself. Specific steps here are establishing good channels, communication channels to the organizers to make sure that NGOs are informed on progress and once information becomes publicly available, but yet also recognizing the need to protect the privacy of the assembly members during the process to preserve its credibility. So to be guided by the organizers of the assemblies on what information can be released publicly at what point in time. And finally, a couple of steps left after the assembly. So the stage of follow-up and political campaigning, which is the core of what climate NGOs do. And here, step 7 is actually push for a follow-up to the recommendations, which has been the weakest point in the assemblies, as I've mentioned earlier. And so here the steps would be lobbying politicians and decision makers at the minimum to consider the recommendations and to give clear public response on how they're going to be addressed. Secondly, considering supporting a mechanism for tracking and assessing the follow-up to the recommendations after a certain period of time. And we have seen that in some assemblies, I think in Spain, but also and now in Austria and in others, where assemblies have decided to come back together, say after a year's point in time, to see how much follow-up has happened. In France, actually, there is an excellent website which tracks the status of follow-up and implementation of the recommendations, and having NGOs actually push for that and monitor that is a very important element in ensuring follow-up. And then specifically picking recommendations that align best with NGOs' priorities for the specific NGO. We have an example, for example, in Austria, Greenpeace Austria was considering using recommendations that the Climate Assembly has produced regarding energy in their campaign that was focusing on energy security and energy poverty. So they found an angle that aligned specifically with their own strategy and used recommendations to amplify the campaign that they had already planned to do anyway. And finally, integrating assembly recommendations into your campaigns. That is something I've already started talking about. This implies the first step is to actually analyze the recommendations of the assembly and identify those that align best with the NGO strategy for the particular institution, campaigning on those recommendations that align best with the priorities, but also amplifying having awareness about those recommendations with other allies, partners, other NGOs and other actors which are campaigning with the NGO on that particular issue. Making politicians aware of the recommendations and also engaging the former assembly members to bring stories to life. And I think those of us who have observed some of the assemblies know that communication that involves members of the assemblies telling their stories in their own words is the most powerful way to actually spread the message. And many assembly members actually are willing and do be politically active after the assembly has finished. So there is a great opportunity for NGOs to actually tap into that politically ready new emerging community and into the community. I'll finish with this. I think I've already mentioned the importance of strategic communication throughout the stages before, during, and after the assembly. And the playbook gives some of the specific tips on the focus of communications at the early stages, more around the concept of an assembly and the benefits it can bring, the importance of public participation and the potential. During the process, talking more about the process at hand and linking to it, to talk about the key issues which are being discussed. And obviously at the end, talking about the linking to the recommendations and the important and highlighting the importance of those. But the key point really is not to leave engagement and communication to the last stage when the recommendations have come out, because that's when the opportunities have missed already. So that's just to remind you of the whole process that we started from. And with these, I'll leave you with those 3 questions for discussion, which I think we're now going to go to the panel who will reflect on some of those, but we will then go to the audience. So please think about those. So the scope of the playbook. Are there any issues missing from what I have presented, or some issues that you disagree with that should not be covered? So please challenge me on that. Any comments on the format and content? And also, I'll be interested if you have a stellar example, be it positive or negative, of NGO engagement with Climate Assembly, which you think should be included, please do come forward. And just to say, we're going to publish the slides after the event, as always, so you'll have also an opportunity to read them in your own time if you'd like to, and I will be grateful for any feedback. So I'll stop here with the slides, and perhaps before we go to the panel discussion, I just wanted to check if there are any clarification questions first. Not discussion yet, but any clarification questions. Please raise your hand if you do have any. I don't see any hands. Okay, since there are no hands, it seems, on clarification questions, we're now going to go to our wonderful panel to get their reactions, but also additional insights on issues around NGO engagement. And so our first speaker, first panelist is Maria Jose Sanz, who is a scientific director of BC Free Center, Research Center in Spain. And Maria Jose personally and her institution have been very closely involved in Spain's Climate Assembly. And of course, many of you actually know Maria Jose. So Maria Jose, lovely to have you with us. So first over to you. So what was your experience in Spain in terms of NGO engagement with Climate Assembly, and what feedback would you give on the playbook based on what you have experienced?
Do you hear me now? Oh, well, yes. Thank you, Aline, for your excellent presentation. I think you cover most of the issues. I would say all of the issues I could imagine. So thanks, and I think it's going to be extremely useful. What is going to be in the playbook? I can share first some of the experiences we had with the Spanish Assembly. I guess to give you some background context, with the Spanish Assembly, the government was announcing the possibility early, but unfortunately, it was a delay in the actual implementation of the Assembly, which was one of the major critics by NGOs in Spain, that why the Assembly was not launched earlier. And the reason for that was that the government wanted to have the climate change law adopted to cover the Assembly under the law, which is now in one of the articles, the possibility to launch citizens' assemblies. So all this atmosphere at the beginning was creating some tensions between the government who was launching the Assembly and the NGOs. When the governance was structured, it is true, Alina, as you said, that all the interest groups were consulted on the design and they give feedback. And obviously not all the feedback as it was provided was incorporated in the final design, which was launched through ministerial order, which didn't come with all the details in terms of many of the ways of the knowledge was transferred later in the process. And they because the atmosphere was not so pleasant due to what I said before, they had this tendency to say, well, because not all our things were incorporated, the assembly process is not going to be what we expected. In the governance, what it was decided also was that instead of having an pure academic expert group behind the governance, to have an expert group which covers also the areas that are more on the expertise of the sectors, for example, private sector or the labor wall, consumption. So there were not only scientific experts in the expert group, let's say. And among those experts, we got experts from some of the big NGOs in Spain, and they themselves decided who from the NGOs was going to be in the expert group, meaning that the 5 big NGOs among themselves, they decided that it was one expert from Greenpeace, the director of Greenpeace, and the director of the WWF, who were engaged into the expert group, very deeply indeed. I will explain later. Then Extinction Rebellion was also being very critical on the process, and it was offered to them to be part of this expert group, but they refused to be in the expert group. They said they didn't want to, which is okay. I mean, you also can choose to have your watchdog role not being contaminated by trying to engage into the process itself. So that was how the whole process started. I think from the steps that you mentioned in your presentation, in the case of Spain, in many of these steps, the NGOs, the big NGOs were sort of engaged. They were engaged in the design of the process. They were sending comments to the government. Some of them were incorporated. They were engaged into providing expertise, which I think it was good. And I want to raise the issue that the NGOs, at least these big ones, they have a very broad view of the environmental and climate change issues. So they were, in a way, very good in trying to be more holistic in terms of what the contributions of the other experts were. So they were sort of being part of gluing, all this expertise that was brought for the question of the Spanish Assembly that was very broad, how to make the country low carbon and more resilient. It was a very broad question. So the expertise brought by NGOs, which, by the way, in these cases, they had also good scientists within. It was very good in terms of integrating knowledge, I think. They were very engaged and in-depth engaged into the process. They were helping to identify experts to provide presentations. They were giving presentations themselves in all the sessions. They were present in all the sessions, both of the NGOs. And they were always very, very clear, saying that they were there to bring expertise, right? While the deliberation was ongoing and the process of knowledge provision to the assembly was given, and excellent in a way to make sure that the knowledge was balanced, so all perspectives were incorporated in the information that was provided to the citizens. So I think in our case, it was a positive. They didn't give up to be critic. I think it was good. They were still being critic with the process and saying, well, the process could be better. But they were also constructive, and that was very good. While other NGOs and more fundamentally Extinction Rebellion remained very much into a very sort of criticism based on that the process was not transparent and things, this type of critics. After the process, we have some stock take overall with the expert group, and they recognized that it was a very good experience, that they were really happy to be involved. And I guess what perhaps they need to think more thoroughly is how to capitalize this, right? This is something that is still, I think, missing somehow, no? Because it was hard. It was hard, is this balance to say, okay, not all the recommendations are going to be implemented, because some of the recommendations are formulated in a way that is difficult to implement them, and some of the recommendations will never be implemented. But I think some of the recommendations were very, very critical, and I think they can capitalize on those. I think they are aligned with some of the recommendations, and they are pushing for those recommendations also with the government. These big NGOs are very much tracking the policy process in the country. So I will say that in a way, maybe not on purpose or design on purpose, they are really aligning with the recommendations by the citizens. And they are also very keen in participating in events with the citizens in the post-assembly process. They were also accompanying the citizens while giving the recommendations to the government. So I think that was a very, very positive environment. But I guess, talking about what the scoping of the playbook is, I think is a very good roadmap for them to be more structurally engaged in this type of processes. And I strongly believe that they will be very happy to see this in written. So I compromise myself to distribute the playbook across the Spanish NGOs and explain why this is there, and try to make sure that they can make value of those processes. So I think we are happy. It is true also that the Marea Deliberativa is doing something in parallel, that's fine, but I think that's healthy. And it's also true that the Spanish members of the Assembly are very active at the moment, and they are still sometimes going back to the NGO experts to request for more information. So they are still keeping, flow of information in between them. And the NGOs are reacting to that. So I think that's also very, very good. And I think with this, I'm done and open to any question if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Jose. That's really really useful insights, and thank you also for emphasizing this the Spanish experience in terms of NGOs trying to balance the roles of the watchdog and the expert contributor. We will come back to you in the discussion, but maybe just one quick follow-up, something which is very much on my mind. Given the quite close engagement of NGOs as experts in the Spanish case, post the assembly, did you pick any criticism, political criticism that would mark the assembly or present the assembly as being dominated by environmental NGO interests, or was it not an issue for you?
No, it wasn't an issue. Not from the NGO perspective, nor from the government perspective. I think the government was very pleased to see that there was a constructive engagement from all sides. Because I mean, frankly speaking, governments are afraid of these processes, no? And bringing an NGO inside of the process, they are really afraid, no? But at the end, I think they were extremely happy that this was done in that way and that they really engaged in the process. And I think there were also conversations afterwards in between the government and the NGOs on these issues as well, in order to make sure that if it's more process like this, they will be improved with the perspectives of the NGOs and their learning through the Assembly's process, because I think that's also very important. The NGOs also did learn through the process. And that's something that I think they recognize also.
Thank you. That's a really important. That's a really important point. So let me go to our next speaker first, and then we'll come back to Maria Jose as well at the end of the panel discussion. So our next speaker is Romain Didi, who is an officer at the CAN Europe, and Romain has very fresh insights from the survey that his institution, which is a network of climate NGOs, has gathered on engagement of civil society in public participation processes and the preparation of national climate and energy plans. And so, Romain, really interested to get your feedback on what have you learned from those experiences, and also what would be your feedback on the playbook based on that? So over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alina. I hope everyone can see my screen. I'm not sure about my connection, so I will just stop my video, but you will hear me continuously. So yes, indeed, I would like now to enlarge a little bit the scope of the discussion to include another public consultation process that is taking place at the moment about national energy and climate plans, which are also called NECPs. So just a little bit of context, member states have to submit to the European Commission NECPs covering a 10-year period. So the current one covers this decade, so from 2020 to 2030. And member states have to revise their NECPs. They have to submit their draft revised NECPs this June 2023, and their final revised NECPs in June 24. And before submitting their draft revised NECPs, they have to carry out some kind of public consultation. And what we've tried to do with our survey, together with WWF, is to assess what is exactly the state of play now, 3 months before the deadline for the submission. Have those public consultation process taken place or not? And as you will see, I think that some of the main messages that I will explain now could be also applied to climate assemblies. So I will try to explain all this. Before Yeah, so before going into the results of our survey and the findings, I think it's important to take some time to really look at the regulatory context. And this context is actually explained in Article 10 of the Governance Regulation, which was already mentioned by Alina. And so this provision requires that member states provide early enough and effective opportunities to the public to participate in the revision process of NECPs. Member states also have to make sure that the public is informed so that it is provided with the right information to be able to provide a meaningful participation in the consultation process. And also member states have to make sure that reasonable timeframes are given for the public to participate. This provision is often seen as a bad provision on public consultation because there are many things missing in the provision. Of course, reasonable timeframes are required, which is compliant with the Aarhus Convention, which protects the right to public participation in environmental matters. And this is a really important point, but there's no quantified or specific time frame that is specified. And this is a bit of a problem, as we will see a bit later on. In addition, the provision does not require that the public consultation process takes place when all options are still open, and this really is a missing element. There's also no real provision explaining what governments have to do with the outcomes of the public participation process. And finally, there's no provision granting access to justice to challenge public consultation if it does not take place in the right way. So I think it was important to explain this a little bit before going further. This public consultation process is one segment of the public participation under NECPs, and the second one is the so-called multi-level climate and energy dialogues, which are established by Article 11 of the same governance regulation. And this is a concept that is a little bit unclear for some member states, I think. And it is basically about providing a platform for many different types of actors and all relevant stakeholders, really, as well as the general public, to discuss the Union's climate neutrality objective, as well as the scenarios envisaged for energy and climate policies. It's important to underline here that NECPs may be discussed in the framework of these dialogues, but there are member states are not obliged to put NECPs at the center of these dialogues. Now, what we've tried to do with our survey was really to understand what's happening on those two parallel processes, so the public consultation and the establishment of these multi-level dialogues. And so we've circulated the survey within CAN Europe's and WWF networks. And so all respondents are grassroots organizations that are working at national level and that are involved in some way in NECP's revision, that are keeping a look on what's happening, at least. And we've tried to frame our survey with only objective questions. So has a public consultation taken place? Yes, and yet? Under what format? Has a specific website being launched for this public consultation process or not? And we've tried to avoid subjective questions such as, what do you think about it? Or what's your take? Do you think that you were given enough space or not? We've tried really to keep it to facts. And the objective with this survey is, of course, that we would like to present our findings to the Commission and to get the Commission to include some specific recommendations on public participation when it assesses a draft revised NECPs for each member state. So these recommendations have to come by the end of December this year. And so we would really like to get some clear guidelines on what member states should do to have better public participation processes, given what has happened so far. And then on the longer term, we would like to demonstrate that this provision, Article 10 of the Governance Regulation and Article 11, are not really adequate to ensure correct public participation process. So we're trying to gather data to demonstrate this. One disclaimer here. So we've not yet published our findings. So everything I will talk about now is still preliminary, let's say, and we are double checking it. So I would just ask not to go public about it yet, but the briefing will be published on our website in 2 weeks, and we will make sure that you have access to it. So who responded? So we got 35 responses covering 23 EU countries. So I've put this on the map below so that you can see. We have several key messages on the public consultation process. So first, the bad news is that only in the very vast majority of member states, the public consultation has not taken place yet. In 17 countries out of those 23. Most of the time when a public consultation have taken place, it was in the form of a preliminary survey or something really preliminary, and the quality of the public consultation really varied greatly in those countries where the consultation process has started. So for example, in France, online panels were organized, but they only tackled the energy side of NACPs so far, and also the public was not given a draft version of the revised NACPs before the public consultation process, which is a problem because you need to have good access to information to provide meaningful consultation. And then we have also good examples. So for example, in Lithuania, the public consultation process lasted for 9 months with a dedicated NACP web page, and so we see this as real good practice. Now that's for the public consultation process. Now on the multi-level climate and energy dialogue side of thing, our findings are a bit similar. So in 15 out of the 22 countries, there's no dialogue that has taken place yet, and in 2 countries, respondents just didn't know what was happening with those dialogues, which is a finding in itself, because if grassroots NGOs working on NACPs are not even aware that dialogues are taking place, even if they are taking place, this is an issue. So the publicity of these dialogues and the public consultation process is also at issue here. In several other countries, there was some kind of platform which could be identified as a multi-level climate and energy dialogue, but these structures were either not operational at the time of responding, or NACPs were not integrated into discussion. And yeah, in the end, we saw that only in 3 of the 23 countries was a real good multi-level climate and energy dialogue implemented. So these are our preliminary findings. In our survey, we'll make a kind of a country per country detailed analysis on what's happening in each country, but these are the key findings. Now bouncing back on this playbook that was presented by Alina, I would here insist on the 4th point that you mentioned, which was to contribute to the Assembly's design, because I think that what we're seeing at the moment on the public consultation and the multi-level climate energy dialogue processes are actually the outcome of the very bad provisions that I presented at the very beginning. This is what happens when you have not enough details in the provision, and when member states are given too much room of maneuver to implement the public consultation process. So I think this is really my key message here, that NGOs should really be engaged at the very on the very design of the law that is creating a climate assembly or a public consultation process on environmental matters, to make sure that some guarantees are given to ensure a correct public participation. That was maybe my key message here. What I've written on this slide is more tailored to NACPs in themselves. Yeah, I think that's it. Now, if you need further resources on NACPs, I've put some link here, and yeah, I will just remind that our briefing will be published by mid-April. Thanks a lot for your attention. I hope that was clear, and I will stop now.
Thank you so much, Roman. That was perfectly clear and well, quite alarming messages there, I think, for your initial assessment. Yeah, in particular, the lack of real dialogues and public participation, mainly treated as some sort of website consultation to tick the box. I think we have our challenge cut out in front of us. And thank you so much also for emphasizing the importance of early engagement, really useful feedback. I think we'll come back to you in the discussion, but before that, I'd like to go to Frederick Hafen, who is the Environmental Democracy Policy Officer at the European Environmental Bureau. And Frederick's organization also is a network, essentially, of organizations spread around Europe. So Frederick, I'm really interested in your feedback from your experience of engaging both at the European level, but also through your country offices. Do you think the playbook captures kind of the key elements of NGO engagement and public participation process and climate assembly? And yeah, any feedback you have, and also if you can talk about some of, if there are any additional opportunities coming up in terms of impacting policy in addition to what Romain has already outlined, also please feel free to comment on that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alina, and thanks a lot for inviting me here as well. And I think it's really good to see sort of the bridging between NGOs and the community working around climate assemblies. And I have to say that the credit mostly goes to the latter, to you people, to reach out to us and make sure we're involved. And this is very much welcome. And I think the playbook is an excellent example of that. So yes, I represent the EEB, the European Environmental Bureau. We're based here in Brussels. But we have about 190, I think it's by now, member organizations all across the European Union member states, future member states, and unfortunately, I have to also say past member states in the UK. We all work specifically also on public participation. Mostly, most of our expertise is around the Aarhus Convention that you mentioned, Alina, also already at the very beginning. So we engage with EU legislation, trying to make sure it is in line with the Aarhus Convention, but we also engage at the UNECE level of the convention itself. At the moment, we're also working on a project that you're well aware of, called The Real Deal, which includes the European Association for Local Democracy as well, looking at some of these deliberative approaches and how they can implement the European Green Deal. I think one of the main key takeaways from today, at least for me, and I've learned a lot listening to you, is to really see climate assemblies as a tool, and to take that into our advocacy going forward as well. In a way, the way we've thought about climate assemblies in the past is a little bit as a way to compensate or complement bad public participation structures in legislation and specific policies. So when we see that there's weak public participation structures in an area, then we think, okay, climate assemblies can fill the gap there and maybe address aspects where public participation is incredibly weak. And we see that me specifically at the European Union level, where we advocate a lot to include stronger public participation provisions in legislation. And then I always have to be aware of that this is legislation will then be in some member states even further downgraded by their weak implementation. So here really we can see climate assemblies as a tool there to maybe help bridge the gap. I wanted to say one thing about the reasons for public participation, which you've mentioned in the beginning, and there's a lot of scientific backing in general why it's good, why it's needed in a democracy. I think one of the things that we like to focus on, especially in the area of environment and climate, is that public participation creates higher quality decisions. Higher quality decisions of course a value judgment, but it's coming from me working for an environmental NGO. So when I mean higher quality decisions, I mean more ambitious decisions for the environment and the climate. Why do environmental NGOs advocate a lot for public participation? Number one is because it's the right thing to do. Number two is because usually public participation means more progressive policies, because in general, public opinion in environmental matters can end up being a little bit more progressive. Obviously, there's outliers, and I'm sure there's lots of people on the call who would disagree with me making such a blanket statement on public opinion. I think one thing I wanted to touch upon is the difference between public participation and stakeholder participation that you mentioned, because I find that very, very interesting, because I'm guilty of exactly what you say, that as someone working for the NGOs, the way I understand or understood public participation is to include stakeholders or include NGOs as representatives of the public as well. So I think it's really helpful to make that clear what the language is used. And I'm not saying which language is the correct and which language isn't the correct one, but we need to all be using the same one if we talk to each other. Otherwise we talk in parallel and we never cross. I think one of the things that I found interesting in your 8 steps, in my opinion, the question that is not answered in them is sort of the missing step 0 or the 2 missing steps. And the first missing step is something that might not be appropriate to be addressed in the playbook. But first, for an NGO to engage on climate assemblies, it first has to make sure that that is high enough on the agenda for that NGO itself to engage in that. So there's an internal discussion to be had. But that's the smaller hurdle. The bigger hurdle, I think, and that's the true step 0, is to find funding to expand resources, to spend resources and time to engage in these processes. And I think that's something that is absolutely crucial, and that's something that is just the practical bit that is needed for NGOs to work on these issues, especially when it's a process that is not necessarily guaranteed to give the outcomes that you want, or that is difficult to sell to funders, because you can't already beforehand prejudge and say this is what's going to come out of it, and yes, we're going to throw our full weight behind it and advocate for these outcomes when you don't know what these outcomes will be. So I'm sure there's good answers for that, and I'd be very happy to hear from NGOs that have been able to find funding to participate in climate assemblies at the national level. And I'm also sure there's structures of how these assemblies can be set up, that there can be funding made available already in the organizational setup of them to allow NGOs to participate. So that would be my comment on the 8 steps. On the point that there's another point that I found very interesting, and you mentioned it as well, and you phrased it, or I forgot now exactly who phrased it, but the sort of the watchdog versus contributor, maybe it was you, Maria, the watchdog versus contributor point of view. So the risk that can be attached to it. I think this is something at the European level we haven't, our organization hasn't seen it with the Climate Assembly, but with the so-called Conference on the Future of Europe, where there was some risks associated with the way it was organized and the process. And your points on robustness and the transparency, I think those points are worth elaborating on. That transparency is the antidote, because I do see how NGOs, and I would think that I would have to have the same discussions with my colleagues if I were to propose to engage in a climate assembly, would be exactly these reputational risks. And there are for every risk there is mitigation measures. So it's just a question of being aware of the mitigation measures that actually work in practice. I think the easiest part at the end, or the least controversial part, is yes, lobby to consider the recommendations that were made. And just to bridge the gap there to the Aarhus Convention world, this is sort of the missing bit of the due account is taken of the public participation. And that's also the piece that's the weakest in legislation in general. And maybe I will stop at this point and just quickly reiterate that I think it's great to see the playbook coming about for NGOs to be used as a tool. And I would say the playbook is a tool for NGOs just as much as climate assemblies can be a tool for NGOs and can be sold as that. And the point about the 8 steps, I think, if it's obviously difficult from a non-NGO perspective to say something meaningful about NGO funding, but I think that is one of the missing links that has to be there before organizations such as ours can engage. Thanks a lot, and I look forward to a healthy debate and a bit of exchange and more opportunities for me to learn.
Thank you so much, Frederick. Really excellent points. And I think the point on funding is very well taken, because indeed quite a few NGOs we interviewed for the first phase of the project actually raised concerns and limitations, not being able to actually engage because of funding constraints. But yeah, I'm very happy to see that our colleagues from the European Climate Foundation are here at the workshop, and they've of course have been supporting quite a lot of NGO engagement on climate assemblies. But I'll think through how we can integrate that into the playbook. Thank you for that feedback and for the other points. So with these, well, thank you for all 3 of you for your contributions. Really good discussion. Now I would like to give the mic to Graham, who will co-chair with me the rest of this discussion. So Graham, please feel free to tear apart the playbook, but also to come back on any of the other points raised.
Oh, that's great, Alina. Thanks so much for everybody, and thanks for the comments from Frederick, from Romain, and from Maria. I just want to pick up on a couple of points, and I thought actually Frederick's, if we don't have the resources, we can't do it, I think is a really is a really important point. And one of the things I was thinking about there was about the potential for NGOs, climate NGOs, to think about looking at some of the democracy foundations rather than the typical climate foundations, to play those kind of, if they're going to play those kind of democracy roles. It's an interesting thought. Just a few points that came to mind. One was, I think it's very useful for us to clarify. So I think this distinction between public participation and stakeholder participation is really useful. But I also think it's what's really useful that Alina has shown us is that even when you have a really structured form of public engagement, like a climate assembly, there can be distinct roles for stakeholders within that process. And I think that's really helpful. I think the real challenge for this, I think, is about the speaking to NGOs, is that NGOs aren't a homogenous group of organizations. And I think the organization, like when we talk about EEB or some of the organizations that is engaging with, or the people that Maria, the Greenpeaces and the WWFs who Maria was engaging with, these are very very established NGOs with reasonably good relationships with government, etc. And I don't think we can necessarily expect the attitude and the behavior of organizations like those to be the same as more radical social movement organizations, whether we're talking about XR or we're talking about Fridays for the Future or whatever, because they have a very different relationship to the state, towards what their expectations of climate action will look like. And so I think that's a really interesting problem in terms of trying to pitch the playbook, because I think we've been tending to have conversations with some of the larger NGOs, and I think it may be slightly different for as I say, for more social movement actors. I know, for example, from personal experience in work or from observation and talking to the people from Scotland's Climate Assembly, they worked really hard to get XR into the stewarding group, and XR at one point decided that it couldn't stay in because all of what it wanted from the assembly wasn't being realized. And I think there was a sense in which there were certain things XR wasn't willing to compromise on, which maybe another organization wouldn't have been such an important point for them. So I think I think that's a really interesting. And I always thought there might be those problems because this was a state organised. It was organised by the Scottish government. It was being facilitated by the Scottish government. And for me, there was no way they were ever going to do all of the things which Extinction Rebellion wanted. Given, you know, it didn't surprise me, put it that way. And so I think there's a kind of different relationship there between different actors within the environmental movement, and we may have to think about how we formulate that. And then just the third thing, I guess, is this question, and I don't know whether or not it's something that you can do more of in the playbook, or whether actually it's pointing people in different directions. And this is the sort of the active sponsoring and organisation of climate assemblies by NGOs. And we're seeing, actually, this seems to be something which we're seeing, but more. There's an interesting development here, of course, with initially the German one, but more recently in the UK with the People's Plan for Nature, where WWF, RSPB and National Trust have actually organised an assembly as part of their campaigning. And it just seems to be a different type of use of this model, and a really interesting development. But maybe what we are talking about here is a playbook, and maybe we should be explicit about that, a playbook for NGOs in relation to government organised, government sponsored assemblies. And maybe we should be clear about that, because we can't do, I don't think we can do both of those things. So those are my immediate response. But I found it very sort of stimulating to be taken through the assembly process, which I'm very familiar with, but from the perspective of an actor who is actually on the outside, or in the, you know, sort of engage, you know, unsure about how to engage that, because I think it gives you a very much a different light on the process.
Thank you so much, Graham. Really useful comments. And I think I very much agree. I think as we went through the discussion today, I was also getting increasingly the sense that we should actually make it clear that there are different types of actors. And as you say, I think the current playbook possibly caters more to some of them. I don't have a good idea yet on how to bring the other types of actors in, but we should definitely think it through.
Just to say, Alina, I don't think there's a problem on being specific about that this is a playbook primarily orientated towards particular actors for particular types of processes. I think that's being honest and saying, look, you know, the majority of these processes are government sponsored. Those are the ones we're thinking of here. And the majority of the actors that we're primarily thinking of here are those more established NGOs. That doesn't mean that what we're saying isn't relevant to more radical social movement actors. It doesn't mean it isn't relevant to government, you know, running your own assembly. Doesn't mean it's relevant to other contexts. So I just think that it's useful just to, I guess, to be clear up front that with this is the way we're thinking, because I don't think we can cater to everybody all of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Maria.
Yeah, I think Graham, you said very useful things. And for example, yes, this is right. The consolidated NGOs is a different audience that other small and more focused NGOs or more extreme NGOs or activists. But I think that some of the different reactions from those other NGOs are coming from some of the misconceptions that Alina was laid out in the presentation. I'm pretty sure that it will be much more aligned reactions, at least on some aspects, by those NGOs if those misconceptions are clarified. Because, for example, in Spain, what happened was that the Extinction Rebellion and some of the extreme NGOs, the small ones, were asking for opening the deliberations to the public, and that's not something that you can do in an assembly. The deliberations of the members should be kept among themselves, and you cannot expose that to the public. So, and that was a misconception that really generated lots of noise. even the NGOs that were participating in the process that had clarified or had understood this better were unable to explain to their colleagues that that was the case. So, and I think that created a lot of noise that could be avoided completely if we all knew and we all had the same basis of understanding of what a citizens' assembly and a deliberative process is.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We've got about half an hour, so we've got about half an hour. So what I'm going to suggest actually is we split into two groups, so we can have a bit of a discussion about what we've heard, about what we think a playbook needs to contain, talk about some of the experience we've had with sort of NGO experience, etc. So Nana and Stina, are you able to break into two groups, one led by myself and one with Alina and Markin? Is that all right?
Yes.
And what we'll do is we'll aim to talk for about 20 minutes. That'll give us 10 minutes to come back and get some reflections from those groups. It'll also give us a little bit of a more intimate time as well to actually discuss these things. So I think Stina or Nana will force us into groups in a second. I think we're all back, but I just realized, Hilmi, did you want to finish off what you're going to say? Do you want to say?
No, it was just on Frederick's comments on public consultation and citizen assemblies. I mean, to my understanding, public consultation, yes, you do what you want to say, but it's just like a one time thing.
Sure.
You say it, it's there. But where the citizen assembly is where you have ongoing dialogue, including policymakers. And I think there's a difference between the two. That is why it's so important to have citizen assemblies ongoing. Yeah. It's not a one-time thing.
Okay.
That was
sorry about the other group, that we were in the middle of something and we wanted to finish the conversation.
Thank you, Graham.
So I'll just give a little bit of feedback from my group because I'll also be interested to see how Alina responds. But a couple of things came out, I think, which were about how NGOs might actually be able to use their membership in terms of amplifying what's going on. So we're thinking about, I think when we think about the playbook, we've been thinking about the relationship between NGO leaders and with the assembly itself. And yet actually, I think there's a really interesting role that NGOs could play in terms of amplifying through their membership. I know that could be part of the communication strategy, but I think that's really critical. And the other thing that came up, we were talking about as well, is the importance of doing peer-to-peer engagement here. In those countries like in Spain, where Greenpeace has had a really good experience, if there's an assembly happening somewhere else, organizers and people like myself or other NGOs could try and actually get peer-to-peer learning. So national organizations talking to other organizations, I think would be really interesting. So those are kind of couple of things that came out. There was more which I can share afterwards. But Alina, I'll hand back to you and thoughts from your group and I guess also just reflections on this last couple of hours.
Well, thanks a lot, Graham. These are actually really good ideas that you've mentioned. So thank you for those suggestions. I think in our group, and please, everyone, feel free to contribute. One idea which came up that might be useful to consider whether engagement of NGOs at different levels of governance, for example, national assemblies versus local assemblies, brings any particular differences. We talked quite a bit about the challenge, and that was also in the steps in the playbook, of NGOs engaging actively up front before they know the outcomes, and how can we get around those challenges. I don't think we got very clear answers to that, but I think one idea that was coming strongly is that the more experience NGOs get with those processes, the more confident they become that they can actually be a useful tool in political campaigning and in implementing their own strategy. We also talked about the issues around media not picking up on climate assemblies, particularly because there is no conflict involved. It's all about consensus building and how NGOs could actually help overcome that challenge. I'm trying to see, Mark, please help me if, or others if I'm missing any other important points.
Oh, you did a great job, Alina. Maybe just want to add one thing that we were kind of discussing, whether also there's a risk of NGOs delegitimizing processes if they get too involved. And I think we actually all kind of agreed that they don't generally do that, at least not if they're pushing for assemblies to happen. That's generally positive. They also don't do it if they're helping disseminate results afterwards. But of course, the place maybe to be conscious is in setting up the governance and running assemblies and in providing evidence to assemblies, that there are some concerns to make sure you have balance in those fora. I think I don't know if I'm summing that up correctly, Adina, but that's my only addition.
That's perfect. And very quickly, Bjorn, I know you got cut off just before we finished. Is there anything you wanted to come in on?
I'm just typing in my questions here in the chat, because I'm curious to explore, you know, what Romain mentioned about the design features that that he thought NGOs should have an influence over, and explore what and how would they like to change. That's worth exploring. I'm also interested in understanding if the Can Europe survey, which understanding or which interpretation of public participation is used, and what is Romain's view on the distinction you make right at the beginning, Alina. And for Frederik, I'm interested in understanding how much would it take to reach a place where NGOs would not have to think so much about whether or not they should dedicate resources, remuneration for participating in a knowledge committee, for making presentations and so on. Would that be enough? And for the rest of the community, what are their thoughts on potentially differentiate between the conditions we offer to NGOs, which everyone knows have fewer resources, and say a large industry stakeholder organizations, which we know have plenty? Would that just be seen as leveling the playing field, or would it be seen as favorizing a certain voice in the discussion? Yeah, and no time to answer the questions, I know.
Sorry, am I in charge? Sorry, I forgot I was.
Yeah, you are, sorry.
Romain, did you want to say something quickly, because we're getting towards the end? We really, it's typical. Bjorn just throws a bunch of hand grenades in right at the end and expects everybody to respond. You know, what can I say?
I'll be super quick, but on the design of the public consultation process, I guess it's really about securing the RS rights. And I will just paste a link in the chat about which guarantees should be included in this public consultation process. Here it's again on the NECPs, but I think the scope can be broadened to other public consultation space, such as climate assemblies. And then on your second question on the distinction between public consultation and stakeholder consultation, this is something we've tried to highlight in our briefing, with a focus on the public consultation, which is about public, and then on the multi-level dialogues, which are more about stakeholders consultation. So both aspects will be present. And I think I forgot one of your questions, but that's a rapid response.
Alina, is there any final word you want to say?
Just to thank everyone. This has been hugely valuable. I think lots of ideas. So thank you so much. Okay,
so I shall just close proceedings. First of all, I'd like to thank Alina for all the work she's done. I'd like to thank and really looking forward to the final product. I'd like to thank Maria Jose, Romain, and also Frederik for their contribution. Oh, Maria, did you want to say something just very quickly?
just want to ask, because I will be very happy if I can share the presentation with the NGOs themselves, so that they.
So, yeah, the presentation will be up on the website alongside the recording of the event, and that will go up in the next 2 or 3 days. And we'll make sure that we'll send an email around maybe to let people know that it's there. So that's definitely happening. And then hopefully in the next month or two, we'll actually have the actual nice shiny product as well. So so thank you to the 4 of you who spoke today. Thank you to Stina and to Nana and to Mark for the technical support. I think this is going to be a really important contribution. I think we sometimes beat ourselves up a bit about things didn't work very well in a certain context, or we didn't get it quite right. But we've got to remember this is a really new institution, and we're still trying to figure out exactly how they work, how to integrate different actors into the process. So these conversations and these sorts of playbooks are really, really critical, I think. And just to advertise a couple of forthcoming activities in May, and we'll put details up on the website soon. We've got a couple of really interesting workshops. One on supporting what should we do to support assembly members after the assembly is finished. So most of the focus is on running the assembly. What actually should we, what duties do we have towards assembly members, or what resources should we provide? What support should we provide? And also we're going to do a session looking at whether or not assemblies can deal with systems change questions, these kind of systemic questions rather than just policy. But the next call is actually going to be a learning call, which is in mid-April, which is on the 19th of April, which is a learning call on the Polish Citizens Assembly on energy costs. And that's very relevant because that was actually organized by an NGO or 2 or 3 NGOs in Poland, and was run independently as a way of raising the profile of citizens and climate assemblies. So do come along to the call on the 19th, and if not, we'll see you hopefully at a future workshop, one of our future workshops. It's really great that we're doing these much more focused workshops on particular aspects of climate assembly practice. I think it's really going to be the way that we take things forward. So once again, one final thanks to Alina. It's a really great piece of work, and thank you for everybody for engaging so enthusiastically with it. Take care, everyone.